Number 1. The rule that gets foreigners kicked out of Vietnam faster than anything else. Every year, thousands of expats show up in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City chasing the dream. $200 rent, $5 dinners, a life that feels like early retirement at 28. And every year, a handful of them break one unspoken rule that the entire local business community quietly enforces. We'll get to that rule in a moment, because once you understand it, you'll understand everything else about how this country actually works. Vietnam in 2026 is not the backpacker fantasy people post about online. It's a country of 100 million people grinding through 12-hour workdays, 6 days a week, to build what might be the fastest-growing economy in Southeast Asia. GDP growth sitting above 6%, while most of the developed world limps along at 1 or 2. A place where a plate of pho costs $1.50, but a factory worker in Binh Duong province might only make $300 a month for the privilege of making your sneakers. This is the real Vietnam. Not the one on travel blogs, the one where rent really is $200, but so is half a month's local salary. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Think about that gap for a second, because it's the thread that runs through every single thing we're about to cover. A country can be growing fast and still have millions of people living paycheck to paycheck. A city can look like a bargain paradise on Instagram and still be one of the more expensive places on earth for the people who actually call it home. Vietnam holds both of these truths at once, and most content about the country picks one and ignores the other completely. We're not doing that here. Number 2, the $200 apartment that isn't what it looks like online. Search Hanoi apartment for rent, and you'll find glossy listings. A furnished one-bedroom in Tay Ho, the expat Lake District, $200 a month, rooftop pool, gym downstairs, motorbike parking included. It looks like a mistake. It isn't. Vietnam's property market runs on a split system. Almost nobody explains properly. There's the local price, and there's the foreigner price, and the gap between them can be enormous. A Vietnamese family renting a similar unit 2 streets over might pay $120. The foreigner gets charged more because landlords know Western renters compare against New York or London, not against the neighbor's lease. But here's what the listings don't show you. That $200 apartment in Tay Ho is usually a serviced unit in a building packed with other foreigners, insulated from the city outside. Walk 15 minutes away into the older residential alleys, the Hem, and you'll find apartments for $100 that come with peeling paint, a squat toilet, and a landlady who lives on the ground floor and monitors every guest you bring home. This is where most Vietnamese families actually live. 3 generations under one roof, in a house 4 meters wide and 20 meters deep, built up instead of out, because land in the cities is absurdly expensive relative to income. And that's the paradox nobody talks about. Vietnam has some of the cheapest rent in Asia for foreigners, but some of the most expensive housing relative to local wages anywhere in the region. A modest house in central Ho Chi Minh City can cost the equivalent of 30 years of an average salary. Young Vietnamese professionals in their late 20s are still living with their parents, not out of preference, but because buying a home on a local salary is nearly mathematically impossible. There's a specific reason land became this expensive so quickly. Vietnam technically doesn't allow private land ownership in the Western sense. All land legally belongs to the state, and what people buy and sell is a long-term usage right, typically 50 years, renewable but not guaranteed in every case. This creates a strange speculative energy in the property market, because usage rights in prime urban districts get treated almost like gold, traded, flipped, and hoarded by wealthier families and investors. Foreigners generally cannot own land outright at all, only apartment units under specific ownership caps within a building. which is part of why so many end up renting instead of buying, even when they plan to stay for years. So, when a foreigner shows up paying $200 for a place that would cost a local family half their income, it creates friction. Landlords love it, neighbors resent it, and this tension is the seed of the rule we mentioned at the start. We'll get there. First, you need to understand what a workday actually looks like here, because it will change how you see that cheap rent completely. Number 3, the 12-hour workday that nobody in the West would survive. In District 7 of Ho Chi Minh City, a woman named Lynn runs a small tailoring stall. She opens at 6:30 in the morning and closes near 9 at night, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during Tet season, when everyone needs new clothes at once. That's not unusual, that's standard. Vietnam's labor culture is built on an idea, imported partly from Confucian discipline and partly from decades of post-war scarcity, that rest is a luxury you earn after the work is done, and the work is never quite done. Factory workers producing goods for Nike, Samsung, and Adidas frequently work 10 to 12-hour shifts, and mandatory overtime during peak production seasons can push that past 60 hours a week. The legal cap on overtime was actually raised in recent years, specifically to accommodate manufacturing demand, not reduced. Street vendors, the ones selling banh mi at dawn and grilled meat skewers at midnight, often work split shifts across 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no concept of a weekend, because a closed stall means zero income. There's no safety net underneath them. If you don't open the stall, you don't eat that week. Compare that to the average foreign remote worker living in Da Nang, earning in dollars, working maybe 25 hours a week on a laptop from a beachside co-working space, paying that same $200 in rent. The gap between these two lives, happening on the same street, is the actual story of modern Vietnam. It's not that the country is cheap, it's that dollars and salaries here operate as two almost entirely separate economies stacked on top of each other. This is also why locals sometimes look at foreigners with a complicated mixture of hospitality and quiet resentment. Not because they dislike Westerners, because they watch someone work a quarter of the hours they do for the same or better lifestyle in the same city they were born in and can't afford to fully enjoy. Keep that tension in your head. It matters for what comes next. There's a generational layer to this too. Older Vietnamese, people who lived through the aftermath of the war and the extreme poverty of the 1980s before the Doi Moi economic reforms opened the country up, tend to view the current grind as almost luxurious by comparison. Against that memory, a 12-hour workday with a motorbike and a smartphone looks like remarkable progress. But the younger generation, comparing their lives against influencers in Seoul and Singapore, don't have that historical reference point, and they feel the grind very differently. Number 4, the food that costs less than a coffee back home, and the reason it stays that way. A bowl of pho on a plastic stool costs somewhere between $1 and $2. A banh mi, 75 cents. A full lunch of com tam, broken rice, with grilled pork and a fried egg, maybe $2.50. For a foreigner earning in dollars or euros, eating out 3 meals a day can cost less than a single fast food meal back home. But this pricing isn't charity, and it isn't magic. It's built on razor-thin margins that Vietnamese vendors accept because the alternative, raising prices to Western levels, would simply mean losing every local customer overnight. Vendors buy ingredients daily from wet markets at dawn, often walking or biking to source the cheapest vegetables and meat available that morning. There's no refrigerated supply chain cushioning costs the way there is in a Western grocery store. It's fresh because it has to be sold today, and it's cheap because the entire system depends on volume and speed, not margin. This is why some expats fall into an uncomfortable habit. They start haggling over prices that are already absurdly low by their own standards, arguing over the equivalent of 20 cents with a vendor who's been up since 4 in the morning. It rarely goes the way they expect. Vietnamese sellers, particularly older women running family stalls, will sometimes simply refuse to sell, rather than accept a lowball offer that insults the effort behind the product. Money matters, but dignity matters more, and a lot of foreigners misjudge that balance completely. There's also a quieter economic reality behind the food prices. Rice, Vietnam's staple crop and one of its largest exports, keeps domestic food costs artificially low because the government has historically prioritized food security and price stability over farmer profit. Farmers in the Mekong Delta, growing the rice that ends up in your bowl of com tam, often earn shockingly little per harvest relative to the labor involved. The Mekong Delta itself deserves a closer look because it's disappearing faster than most people realize. Rising sea levels and saltwater intrusion are slowly poisoning rice paddies that have fed the country for generations. Farmers who once grew 3 rice harvests a year are now sometimes forced to switch to shrimp farming because the soil has become too salty for rice at all. This is quietly pushing another wave of young people out of farming villages and into the cities, looking for factory work, which only adds more pressure to the already crowded labor markets in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. Number 5. The healthcare gap that catches every foreigner off guard eventually. Vietnam has 2 healthcare systems running in parallel, and almost no one explains this clearly before you arrive. There's the public system, which is inexpensive, occasionally overcrowded, and where doctors, though often well-trained, may not speak much English. Then there's the private international hospital system in cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, where care is excellent. Staff often speak fluent English, and prices sit somewhere close to what you'd pay in a mid-tier Western country, not the 50-cent stereotype people imagine. A basic consultation at a public clinic might cost $5. That same consultation at an international hospital catering to expats could run $80 to $150. Emergency surgery or serious treatment at a private facility can reach costs that shock people who assumed cheap country meant cheap everything. This is where a lot of digital nomads get burned. They arrive without real health insurance, assuming Vietnam's low cost of living extends to medical care, and then face a 5-figure bill after a motorbike accident, which, statistically, is one of the most common ways expats end up in the hospital here in the first place. Motorbikes are the backbone of Vietnamese transportation, over 70 million of them on the roads nationwide, weaving through intersections with a traffic logic that looks like chaos, but actually runs on constant micro-negotiation between drivers, a rhythm locals learn from childhood, and foreigners almost never fully master. Traffic accidents are a leading cause of injury and death in the country, and foreigners renting a bike for the first time, often without a proper international license, make up a disproportionate share of serious accident cases in expat hospitals. There's a specific detail insurance companies rarely explain clearly either. Many travel and expat insurance policies contain exclusions for motorbike accidents specifically, especially if the rider didn't hold a valid Vietnamese or international motorcycle license at the time of the crash. This means a foreigner can pay for insurance every single month, get into an accident on a rented scooter with no proper license, and discover the policy simply won't pay out because of the fine print. The lesson buried in all this: cheap living in Vietnam is real, but it's not unconditional. It applies fully to food, mostly to rent, partially to transportation, and only barely to healthcare if something actually goes wrong. Anyone building a life for $500 a month fantasy needs to budget for the one expense that can erase every other savings advantage in a single afternoon. Number 6. The visa game that everyone plays and nobody fully wins. For years, Vietnam's tourist visa policies created a strange subculture of long-term, temporary residents. Foreigners staying on 90-day visas, exiting the country briefly to Cambodia or Thailand, then re-entering to reset the clock, sometimes doing this for years at a time while living full lives in Da Nang or Hoi An. It's called a visa run, and it became such a normalized ritual that entire travel agencies in tourist districts built businesses purely around organizing them. In recent years, Vietnam has tightened this considerably, introducing longer visa options for some nationalities, while cracking down harder on people who were clearly using tourist status to live and sometimes work illegally in the country long term. Digital nomad visas exist in name in some neighboring countries, but Vietnam has been slower and more cautious about formalizing that path, largely because the government is protective of its domestic labor market and doesn't want a flood of foreigners undercutting local wages by working remotely for Western salaries while paying zero local tax. This caution connects directly to something most travel content ignores entirely. Vietnam is not desperate for foreign residents the way some smaller economies are. It has 100 million people, a young workforce, and an economy growing fast enough that the government can afford to be selective about who it welcomes long-term and under what conditions. There's also an enforcement pattern worth understanding. Immigration checks in Vietnam tend to be quiet and administrative rather than dramatic. There's rarely a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Instead, problems surface at renewal time, when an agent processing a visa extension notices irregularities, or when a business registration audit flags a foreigner working under a tourist status. The consequences are usually financial fines and a re-entry ban rather than anything more severe, but the ban can last years, effectively ending someone's Vietnam chapter permanently. That selectiveness is part of why the unspoken rule we mentioned at the start exists in the first place, and why breaking it carries real consequences, not just awkward looks. Number 7. The rule. Here it is. Finally, plainly. Foreigners are, unofficially and sometimes officially, expected to avoid directly competing with locals for low-skill jobs and small-scale local business niches. Opening a tiny street food stall selling pho as a foreigner, undercutting a Vietnamese family who has run that exact business for 2 generations, is one of the fastest ways to generate serious local resentment and sometimes real bureaucratic friction, because business licensing for foreigners in certain small-scale local commerce categories is intentionally restrictive. This isn't written on a sign anywhere. It's absorbed through observation, through conversation, through the subtle way of local business associations and even neighborhood authorities respond when a foreigner tries to set up in a lane that's understood, culturally, to belong to local families. Foreigners who open English centers, import businesses, tech startups, boutique hotels, or higher-end restaurants generally face far less friction because those categories are seen as bringing in outside capital and skills rather than taking a slice of an already thin local pie. The foreigners who get into real trouble are usually the ones who don't bother learning this distinction. They see cheap rent, cheap labor, and a gap in the market, and they jump in without understanding that the market gap they spotted was actually protected space for a local family's livelihood. Complaints get filed. Licenses get scrutinized more heavily than they otherwise might. Sometimes the business simply gets quietly strangled through selective enforcement of regulations that exist on paper for everyone, but are applied unevenly in practice. It's not corruption exactly. It's a kind of social contract. Vietnam opened its doors to foreign money and foreign lifestyles at a scale few expected even 15 years ago. But the unspoken price of admission is respecting which lanes are for guests and which lanes are reserved, culturally, if not always legally, for the people who were here first. Working those 12-hour days long before any expat showed up with a laptop and a dream of cheap living. There's a real story that circulates among long-term expats in Hoi and about a foreign couple who opened a small banh mi cart near the old town, pricing their sandwiches slightly below the established local carts nearby. Within a few months, local vendor associations had complained to the district authority the couple's business license was suddenly under review for technicalities that had never been enforced against anyone else on that street. And within a year, they'd quietly closed and moved into teaching English instead, a category with far less friction. Number 8. The money reality behind the postcard version of Vietnam. Minimum wage in Vietnam varies by region, with the highest tier covering major cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, sitting at a level that, when converted to dollars, looks shockingly low to Western eyes, often somewhere in the range of $200 to $250 a month for full-time work. Skilled professionals, engineers, managers at multinational companies can earn considerably more, sometimes $800 to $1,500 a month, which locally represents genuine upper-middle-class comfort. But the cost of aspiration in Vietnam is climbing fast. Motorbikes, smartphones, education for children, all the markers of modern middle-class life, cost roughly the same in dollar terms as they would anywhere else in the world, even though local salaries remain a fraction of Western equivalents. A decent smartphone costs the same in Hanoi as it does in Los Angeles. A semester of private school tuition for a child can eat up a shocking percentage of a family's annual income. This mismatch creates enormous pressure, which is part of why so many people work such long hours in the first place. It's not just cultural, it's mathematical necessity. Meanwhile, foreigners earning Western salaries or freelance income in dollars experience an entirely different Vietnam, one where the same smartphone represents a tiny fraction of monthly income, where saving 50% of your earnings while living comfortably is genuinely achievable. This is the core paradox, powering the entire cheap living narrative that draws people here. It's not that Vietnam is cheap, it's that foreign currency, when spent inside a lower wage economy, buys a dramatically inflated version of comfort at a cost mostly invisible to the person spending it. There's a specific class of Vietnamese worker caught right in the middle of this gap: bilingual young professionals working for foreign companies or in tourism, earning salaries that look decent by local standards, sometimes $600 to $900 a month, but who spend their days serving, translating for, or managing foreigners, earning 3 to 5 times that amount for comparable or even less skilled work. This group experiences the inequality of the two economies most acutely, because they see both sides up close every single day. Number 9. The culture shock nobody warns you about. And it isn't the food or the traffic, it's the directness. Vietnamese social culture, particularly among older generations, doesn't cushion opinions the way a lot of Western cultures do. A shopkeeper might tell you flatly that you're getting fat, that your Vietnamese pronunciation is terrible, or that you're overpaying for something, all without any intended cruelty. It's simply considered honest, and honesty here often takes priority over the kind of polite indirectness Westerners are trained to expect. At the same time, there's an intense warmth underneath that directness that catches people off guard in the opposite direction. Invite yourself to sit near a family's table at a street stall, and within minutes you might be handed food you didn't order, insisted upon by someone who decided you looked hungry. Get a flat tire on a rural road, and it's entirely normal for a stranger to stop, fix it themselves, refuse payment, and simply ride off. This isn't performative hospitality for tourists. It's a genuine social norm, rooted in community obligation that predates mass tourism by centuries. Foreigners who stay long enough often describe a strange emotional whiplash, feeling bluntly criticized one moment and then overwhelmed with generosity the next, sometimes from the very same person. Understanding that these aren't contradictions, but two expressions of the same underlying directness, is often the actual turning point where an expat stops feeling like a confused tourist and starts feeling like they've genuinely settled into the rhythm of the place. There's a related shock around family structure that catches almost every long-term foreigner off guard eventually. Vietnamese family obligation runs deep and financially real. It's common for a single working adult, sometimes the only one in a family, to land a well-paying job, to be sending a meaningful chunk of their monthly salary back to parents or younger siblings, not as an occasional gift, but as an expected, ongoing contribution. Foreigners dating or marrying into Vietnamese families sometimes struggle to understand why their partner's income seems to evaporate every month, until they realize an entire extended family's stability is quietly resting on that single paycheck. Number 10. The education pressure cooker that shapes an entire generation before they even become adults. Vietnamese parents pour enormous resources, both financial and emotional, into their children's education, viewing it as the single clearest path out of the exact grind we've been describing throughout this video. Extra tutoring after regular school hours is nearly universal in cities, with kids sometimes attending formal school from 7 in the morning until noon, then heading straight to private tutoring sessions that run until 9 or 10 at night, 6 days a week. The National University Entrance Exam functions as a genuine life fork, determining which university, which city, and often which entire career track a teenager ends up on, and families treat it with a seriousness that borders on obsession. It's not uncommon for a family to spend a significant percentage of their monthly income on tutoring fees for a single child during exam years. The logic is straightforward and unsentimental. A slightly better exam score can mean the difference between a factory floor job and an office job with air conditioning, and parents who've spent their own lives working 12-hour manual shifts are willing to sacrifice almost anything to make sure their children never have to. This educational intensity is also quietly reshaping which foreign businesses thrive here. English language centers are everywhere, in every city, on nearly every commercial street, because English fluency is seen as one of the single highest leverage skills a young Vietnamese person can acquire. This is precisely the kind of foreign-owned business that faces minimal friction under the unspoken rule we described earlier, because it's understood locally as adding value rather than competing for an existing slice of the pie. Number 11. What all of this actually adds up to in 2026. Vietnam is not a cheap country pretending to be developed. It's a rapidly developing country that happens to still be cheap for anyone holding a stronger currency, and that window is narrowing every year. Wages are rising. Real estate in the major cities is climbing fast enough that some analysts describe pockets of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City as genuinely overheated. The $200 apartment that felt like a steal 5 years ago is increasingly harder to find in the neighborhoods foreigners actually want to live in. The 12-hour workdays aren't going away either. If anything, as Vietnam's manufacturing sector expands to absorb supply chains shifting out of China, the pressure on factory labor is intensifying, not easing. This is a country in the middle of an economic transformation that Western nations went through over a century, compressed into a few decades, and the human cost of that compression shows up in every long shift, every family crammed into a narrow house, every vendor who hasn't taken a full day off in years. And the rule, the one about respecting which economic lanes belong to locals and which are open to outsiders, isn't going to loosen either. If anything, as more foreigners arrive, chasing the same cheap living dream, that boundary is likely to get reinforced more explicitly, not less, because the tension between foreign privilege and local grind isn't hidden here. It's visible on every street, every single day, to anyone paying attention. There's a longer arc worth sitting with here too. Vietnam spent the second half of the 20th century absorbing colonization, war, partition, and reunification, followed by a punishing period of economic isolation, before the Doi Moi reforms, beginning in 1986, finally opened the economy to the world. Everything we've described in this video is happening inside a country that's essentially been building a modern economy from scratch in under 40 years. Vietnam isn't behind, it's simply mid-sprint, and anyone visiting or living here right now is watching that sprint happen in real time, whether they realize it or not. So the real question isn't whether you can live well in Vietnam for $200 a month. You can. The real question is whether you understand exactly what that lifestyle is costing the people living right next door to you, working 3 times the hours for a fraction of the reward, in the same city, under the same sun. If this changed how you see the country, or if you've lived it yourself and have a different story to tell, drop it in the comments below, along with where you're watching from right now. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive into what daily life actually looks like in another country. Most people only know from travel photos. See you in the next one.